Okay, so we are actually at the very bottom of Samach Ches Amud Aleph. We had a very lively conversation last week about the Mishnah, which introduced us to a number of concepts that we had some vigorous discussion. And it's the subject of Iska. And Iska, of course, is uh, basically defined as a partnership. And that's the source for what we today have a heter iska for ribis issues. But we talk about that iska in terms of ribis, what's allowed and what's not allowed when two partners come together. When say one is the investor, the money person, and the other person is the action person. So they each have roles, and depending on how the deal is couched, you may or may not avoid ribis. So we went through that very thoroughly, and we ended at the end of the Mishnah. So we're going to start with the Gemara, and I think once we start with the Gemara, then maybe some of the issues from the Mishnah will come back to us. But that's the subject that we are. So the very last line of Samach Chesem Amud Aleph, that so what we said as a matter of fact is that the best way to avoid a ribis issue in this situation, and we'll see the different nuances, is that the person doing the work should get some kind of schar. He should get some kind of a salary or something that takes away the edge of ribis. Otherwise, what we said is it would be ribis because when the when the investor puts in money and they agree to split the profits or the losses, then half of the investor's money is an investment and a half is considered a loan. It's considered a loan. So if it's considered a loan, then the worker, if he has no wage or nothing else, he's doing work for the investor, which can be looked at as ribis. It's not just a question of getting the money, but he's doing work. Yes, whether it's selling produce or whatever the Mishnah said. So by doing the work, that's an added benefit to the investor for the loan portion of his investment. And that is not midaraisa, of course, but that's ribis or avak ribis. So we're skirting on the ribis issue because it's a freebie for the investor. So the way to get around that is, as the Mishnah had said, is give him a schar. Some kind of a wage will take off that edge. And so he's being paid for what he's doing. So you can't say it's ribis. Not doing it for free, not doing it because of the loan. He's getting paid. So that's the principle. So now, what the Gemara is going to say is, now we're going to get into the weeds here.
So in effect, Rabbi, excuse me a second, when he gets a wage and he does work, the work is not considered ever to be a repayment of the loan.
Correct.
It
Correct.
has to be almost specified ahead of time.
Right. Right. So by getting a wage, totally independent of whether there was a profit or loss, whether they make money or lose money, he's not in the forefront. I mean, he'll take his chance, of course, because he's going to do the hard work. But the Gemara now is going to tell us into detail how much is the wage. In other words, now we want to understand what it is that we're talking about. The term wage is out there. So he's getting a wage, he's getting a schar, and that's fine. So now the Gemara asks, what is the wage? So this whole Gemara over the next daf is all going to be sort of getting into the detail of what is appropriate. So the Gemara says, Tana, we learned in a brisa, kapoel bottle. What is the wage? The wage is like an idle worker. So let's understand what that means. An idle worker in this context means this fellow has an employment. Okay, the partner, the worker. He has an employment. He's going to give up his employment to be a partner in this deal and work this deal. So he has to give up what he's been doing. So now the Gemara wants us to understand, Kapoel Bottle, what would a worker agree to give up in order to get this wage? So the Gemara will explain to us. I mean, if he's a high paid individual, so then the question is, would he give that up to be a chenveni, to be a storekeeper? And well, that all depends. One of the factors is how much the work is. If this fella makes a lot of money but works day and night like a dog, then maybe he'll welcome a job that is much easier, albeit far less pay. All right, and that becomes a question all the time. Is you have to balance that. So the Gemara is telling us that generally speaking, kapoel bottle, that the wage has to be something that objectively, not only for this guy, because this guy may be a yachid, in terms of what he does, but it means generally what would be the wage that someone would accept to reduce either his hours or his work or whatever it is, and that's what you have to pay him. So in a community where, let's just say, the average was, you I don't know, maybe it was a coal mining community that they worked very hard, made a lot of money, and here you're going to give them work as a chenveni, as a storekeeper to sell produce for the investor, and he's going to make far less money, but he's going to work as hard. So that's what the Gemara is telling us. Objectively, it's kapoel bottle, and every situation is different. There are some workers that would give up, and some workers wouldn't give up the hard work for the money because it's kedai for them to work hard to get the money.
So, Rabbi, is the principle that it's a measurement against what you currently make versus what you will make? So
Correct.
we're trying the delta. So what would be the case if he did this outside of his regular work hours?
You mean he continued his work?
Continued his work and then did this business on the side?
That's a good question. That's a good question because then there isn't sort of a barometer that one could measure and say this is what he would give up. So l'chaira, I would think that a wage in that circumstance would, in other words, the term kapoel bottle would not really apply because he's not exchanging one work for the other. So then really it becomes a question of what the parties negotiate as a fair wage for him to take on this additional work because he's taking on additional work. Now, the investor is telling him, give up your job and you'll get paid here, and then you could make money on the side from the profits of the produce of what we're selling. But that would be not necessarily. In other words, the standard of kapoel bottle would not apply in that case, Michael. So it would have to be something that the parties negotiated and agreed, and there isn't an objective. This is an objective meter by which you evaluate what these salaries should be. In your situation, what you're raising is we don't use this barometer. We don't use this measuring stick because it's outside of what the Gemara is really referring to. So it would have to be a negotiated issue. It wouldn't just be, in other words, when we say kapoel bottle, we're talking about not him individually, but in the context of, say, the community that he lives in. In the community he lives in, this is the standard by which a person not working as hard makes. So you extrapolate from that. Your situation doesn't fall into that at all because now it becomes a personal thing, not an objective community thing, but a personal thing. How much extra is it worth for him to work and what to make? So there isn't the same standard kapoel bottle as there would be if he's actually giving up his work. But
Rabbi, I'm not trying to jump ahead of the Gemara, but I just want to follow up and say, so everything is measured in context to what he's currently doing.
correct.
And the fact of the matter is, and this is only in the case of investor, if he wanted to do something like you said earlier, easier, and was willing to take less money, we don't, he can do that, and we don't try to make him whole, so to speak, because of what he did before. So
Right.
the only time we look at this is if he is getting into a business, and then it's a matter of trying to make him whole. But after he's equal to what he was before, there's no issue with how much he's paid. So if he even got paid, a penny, it would, and that's what they agreed to, it would be okay to.
Right, right. But keep in mind that from the worker's point of view, he believes he'll make up the difference or get close to the difference in the profits of what he's doing. So if he gets a wage, and the wage, let's say, is 50% of what he was making before when he was working very hard, he may say, "Why should I work hard and make 50,000? Let me not work hard and make 25,000." But the profit, I believe the profits will get close to where we were, or maybe close, and I don't have to work so hard. So he has a cheshbon. He really has an outline in his mind why he wants to do this. It's because not because he's not charitable. He thinks that maybe it's time to cut back, and at the same time he'll make some extra money on the profit. And if he winds up with 80% of his former salary, but he works much easier, right?
Be happy with that.
He's happy with that.
Yeah.
Right, right. Your situation, Michael, where he works on top of everything, the Gemara doesn't really get into that because that would be a private thing, not Pearl Bottle, as we said, is a community thing. What would someone in the community give up in order to get this to work easier? But once you talk about outside of this sort of norm, then it's a negotiated thing. He may say, I'll take, I have a regular job, I work hard. I'll take maybe not what would be the community number, but I'll make it up on the profit. So at the end of the day, he'll work not twice as hard, maybe one and a half times as hard, because the presumably the chenveni or the work in this situation is less strained, less stringent than the work that he's otherwise doing. Otherwise, why would he give it up? In other words, if he's on easy street, then giving it up for 50, 60% to be a storekeeper isn't necessarily the way to go. So it's a moving target, but this is a good general rule. So that's what pshat is, poil bottle. So now the Gemara asks my poil bottle. So we've just talked a little bit about it. What does it mean like a poil bottle? Because the Gemara at this point is saying, if you think poil bottle means a idle worker, bottle is the term bottle is idle, then so the Gemara's inherent question is, why is the storekeeper considered a poil bottle? Because he's working. So in other words, we talked this out a little bit, but the Gemara said you get paid like a poil bottle. So now the Gemara wants to know, what is a poil butler? What does it mean, poil bottle? That he's a chenveni, he's a storekeeper, and l'chayra he should make more money than someone who does nothing, because poil bottle means an idle worker. In other words, he's laid off. Right? He gets workman's comp, or he gets whatever it is that he gets for not working. That's classic. That would be the definition of a poil bottle, because he's not working and he gets money. So that was the Gemara's kasha, and the Gemara says, Omer Abaya, that so Abaya wants to define this a little bit better. Kapoil bottle shall osa malacha bottle mino. So we spoke this out that a par bottle means the money that he gets for giving up the work that he had done before. Okay, so this is the definition of a par bottle, which we said, and again, that could be the Gemara specifically says that there is a standard. Now, two people can agree on anything they want, guys. I mean, Michael, it doesn't have to be just, a case of add-on work. If they negotiate and he says, I can't take anything less than 70%, and the rest of the community takes 50, there's nothing that's going to prevent the parties from making an agreement. But if you want to understand, the Gemara says, well, what is the standard? At least we start with the standard being what the community accepts to be a fair reduction in pay for a easier job.
Rabbi, is this the same concept we had a few blocks back where there were laborers who were essentially doing nothing and even going to saloons during the day? And if some other entrepreneur had something for them to do, he could essentially draft them for a short-term work when he had something to do and their actual employer had nothing for them to do.
Right, right. So, yeah, no, that's correct. That's correct. I mean, so what is it a question or?
Well, I mean, is this the same concept as that one, or is this something new?
Well, it's new in the sense that the Chenveni, the person who's going to be the storekeeper, um, he has a job and he's working. It's one thing if he didn't have a job, he was unemployed. So then, they'll negotiate whatever he gets. It'll be fair because he's going to make more than he would be making if he didn't make a nickel. But the chiddush here is that Poyel Bottle is a standard that we adhere to. It doesn't mean it can't be a private negotiation, but if a person came and offered him what the community considers to be a fair reduction for that type of work, then it's not an insulting offer, and it's an offer that the investor can say, "I'm making you a fair offer. I'm making you a fair offer, and you should accept it." And again, the guy can come back and say, "No, I need a little bit more," or whatever. But the whole idea is that because he's sharing in the profits and the losses, and he believes it'll be profitable, that's the impetus for him saying, "I'll give up my day job. I'll make less upfront, but I'll make it up in the investment." That's how we define this. So your situation was, say again, was what? A person,
He's a laborer who works for Ruvain,
yeah,
but he has really nothing. Ruvain has nothing for him to do. He's spending his time idly, even going to saloons during the day. Along comes Shimon. He has some work to do, and he grabs this laborer and says, "Do this for me. I know you're not doing anything for Ruvain.
Is he a
Then do
partner?
some work for me." I mean, he's going to pay him, but he has seemed to have the right to draft him for some temporary period of time.
But that's not a partnership.
No, these will have nothing to do with each other. I'm asking if this is an
no,
outgrowth of the
No.
same
no,
concept.
no, no. It's not because he's starting off from a different starting line. He's not giving up anything. He has nothing. And by the way, what you're saying was a Gemara that we had some time ago, where the question was, if I employ somebody and you come along and want to poach him, right? Let's say I want you to work for me. So we discussed that if Reuven Taka had no work for Shimon, he had no work for Shimon, then the fact that whoever Levi, let's say, comes along and says, "I want him to work for me," is a plus. Because remember, we said that if a person doesn't work and becomes idle, that's not a good thing for the balabas. In other words, the person who normally hires him doesn't want someone to be a freeloader. So when he comes back to him, he's going to not have, the work ethic, so to speak. So the Gemara there says that it's okay, and he welcomes it. He welcomes that someone else should employ him, and this way he'll continue to work. And when he comes back to the original employer, to Ruvain, he won't miss a beat. He's not going to be, "Oh, I had 6 months vacation. Now, I got to go back to work." No, you've been working all this time. But that's not the same. You're right. It's not the same as our situation.
Rabbi, one other question. If the community norm is 50%,
Right.
that they take 50%, could he make an agreement with his investment partner to say, pay me 30%, but we'll split the profits 70-30 instead of 50-50. So whatever, which is the risk of, if the profits are, and that's revenue minus costs, all costs would be, I think they'll be greater than what they are. So I will take the risk and take 70% of the profits. You take 30, but I'll only need to take a 30% wage instead of a 50% wage. Is that permissible?
Is he also going to take 70% of the loss if the
Yes.
venture is not
Yes.
successful?
Yes.
Okay, so he's negotiating and saying, okay, the amount of the partnership, the Gemara doesn't legislate. It doesn't say that it has to be 50-50. 50-50 is the norm when somebody puts up money and someone doesn't put up the money. Then typically, and we see this today too in many ventures where someone has the money and he says, I need you to do work for me, and we'll split the profits. If they say 60-40 or 70-30, that's perfectly fine.
Yes,
They can
but
agree to
in
that.
modern day, it's not a question of you have to have this wage. The wage issue is a guarantee, and the belief is that's for living. So if the community standard is 50% to go into this, and he's willing to take a lesser standard, it's not a guarantee that he's going to make the difference up there. And would the Chachamim view that as a potential ribis advantage for the investor?
No, no, it would not be considered because you said, or someone said right before, what happens if he just gets a penny? I mean, if he gets just a very nominal amount, as long as there is some payment for the work, then that's okay. So the normal standard is what the Gemara talks about, but you're absolutely right. This is in other words, it's not insulting when you say kapayal bottle is I'll pay you what the community pays for this type of work. That's a starting point. It's a starting point. But yes, they can negotiate. There's no backlash if they because he's still getting a wage, and the only reason for the wage is to take off the ribis issue. So if he gets 30% instead of 50%, there's no ribis. There's no ribis because that's what he's willing to do, right? Okay. So now we understand what the wage is. So now the Gemara, remember we said in the Mishnah, we gave two examples in the Mishnah. To go back and take a look for a moment. The Mishnah says that Emoshivin Chanveni, that you can't have a partnership with a Chanveni where the first guy, where the investor gives him, let's say the investor is a farmer and he farms tomatoes. And he says, I've got an abundance of tomatoes. I will deliver a truckload of tomatoes. You sell them and we split the profits. So what's he giving him? He's giving him the chefza. He's giving him the item that he's going to sell. Then the Mishnah says right after that, V'liyitin mos likach behen peris. And he should not give him the money. Let's say he's not a farmer, he's a businessman. And he says to the other guy, here's $100, go out and buy tomatoes, sell them, and we'll split the profits. So in one case, he's giving him the produce, and in the other case, he's giving him money. So the question that we at least initially looked at and said, why does the Mishnah make a distinction whether he gives him the hefza, the actual item to sell, or not? So now the Gemara wants to tell us that the tzricha, and we need both examples, the example of the produce and the example of the money. Why? The itana chenveni, right? If the investor gave him let's say that he gave him the item, right? The investor, let's say, was the farmer, and he gave him the item. And he said, you should be paid like a poiled bottle, right? Because all you have to do is sell it. Then it makes sense why the Chenveni is paid like a poil bottle, because the amount of work he has to do is negligible. He doesn't have to go out, search for someone to buy the produce and do everything else. So I would think that in that particular case, poil bottle makes sense. But why? Because he has a reduced tircha. He has reduced amount of work because he's being literally fed the produce that he has to sell. So what does he have to do? Set up a stand and sell. So I might have thought that that is okay. Avol mos lokech behem peres. But in the case where he's given money, where he now has to go and shop for the item, the nafish tircha, where he has extra work, much extra work, because he has to go and find the Ema Losagale Kapal bottle. So then we might argue that, wait a minute, that's not a Poil bottle. Okay, he was a coal miner or whatever he was before, but now he's a storekeeper, but he still has a lot of work. So it's not as if he reduced his burden so far that he should be treated like a Poil bottle. So the Gemara is conceptually asking, is that a fair analysis to say that in every case Poil bottle works? It works when he has a minimal amount of tircha. But when he has a lot of tircha, because he has to now go and find the produce and set it up and everything else, then maybe he should get more than a Poil bottle. Maybe instead of getting 50%, he should get 70%. So that's the Gemara. So that's the Gemara. So we're saying that's why we need the first. Now, what about, okay, let's flip it around. Let's say we don't talk about produce, we only talk about money. V'itana mos lokech behen peris. And if we say that the Mishnah only is talking about giving the worker money, not produce, then hava amina, I would think chosam hu de boy kapoil bottle. That in the case where he has to go out and actually find the item and sell it and everything else, that's a poil bottle because it's still reduced amount of labor from what he was doing before. Okay, and again, this is an objective standard. So then, aval chendeli the enofish tircha. But in the case of a storekeeper who is given the produce where he has nothing to do other than set up the stand and sell, which means that he's not putting out as much effort, then maybe just a small remittance, a small amount of money would be sufficient. Why is the standard Kapoil bottle a universal standard when the guy doesn't have much to do? If he gives them money, he has a lot to do. He has to find it, buy it, etc. And maybe the first guy, it may take more than one visit to the wholesaler to get the produce. But in the case of money, I'm saying in the case of produce, it's a finished thing. So maybe pile bottle is not the standard, right? So that's and what is the standard? Remember, we're talking about a wage here to avoid ribis. So if it's not pile bottle, what would be the standard? He said if he gave him if he gave him some just some fish sauce or something that he can dip his bread into, which means he's getting something. Or he gave him one fig to eat. In other words, zes charo. That's like you said before, it's a penny. And once he gives him a penny and that's his wage, then there's no longer a question of ribis, right? Because we're not worried that he's going to say, oh, this is insulting, that, how can you consider this to be a wage? This is not a wage. You're giving me a dried fig or something to dip my bread in. But the Gemara is saying that would be schar, des charo. So that's why the Mishnah has to go out of its way to say that either the produce or the money leads to the same end, that the parties have to agree. And again, there's nothing that doesn't allow individual negotiation. And so, Michael, you can negotiate whatever you want, but you have to have a standard, and the standard Kapel Bottle makes sense here in order to remove the issur of ribis because he's getting paid. So
So,
that's how the
Rabbi,
Gemara.
let me ask an example. So, let's say there's no payros. Let's say the investor gives material and tools to build the building, and the worker is going to build the building. So, and they're gonna sell once it's done. They sell the building and they split the profits.
Right.
Does he have to pay? Can he get away with paying him a penny to do the build? Remember that because the investor provided the tools and they have a monetary value, and the person's providing the work, which you don't want him to get something for nothing. But in the end, the finished product, which was nothing, is now going to be sold, and whatever they sell is going to be divided up. So he gets paid in the end. Is that legitimate that they can agree to something, or does he have to get the wage of a construction worker who would be working for someone else and building a building?
Okay, so the first question, okay, it's a good question. So let's start off by saying, what work did he give up to become a construction worker? What did he give up? What was he, a coal miner? I
No,
mean,
let's say he was a construction worker working for somebody else, but he said, the guy pulls him away and says, look, we can make more money in this if we work together, but I'm not going to be able to pay you until we sell the building. So I want you to continue doing what you're doing. You're an expert in constructing buildings, and instead of being paid the wage to work for somebody else, you're doing it with me. We're taking it from scratch, and we'll split whatever we receive the profits for from construction, because there's nothing to sell until the building is complete.
correct. So remember that the whole issue here of ribis is, what would someone who looks at this transaction say about whether or not the worker is giving the investor something more than would otherwise be agreed upon. In other words, let's say he gave him no money, right? Let's say he gave him nothing.
No, not
And
no money, but he gave him materials and tools to
yeah, the
construct.
materials and tools, fine. But the materials and tools is not remuneration for the work. The problem is that the work is what looks like ribis. Why? Because there's a loan here, right? We're going back to what we said. So there's a loan of part of the money, and he is working and giving the investor something on top of the loan. That was the whole question of why it's ribis. Giving him something for his work removes that chashash. Now, so you're asking, well, what happens if he gives him just a very nominal amount, which no other construction worker would take? He wouldn't take just a few bucks to do all this hard work.
But in the end, he may make far
He'd
more than
make
he would
far.
as a construction worker.
That's correct.
So he would benefit. Obviously, he wouldn't do it if there wasn't a potential benefit
That's
beyond
correct.
that.
So the answer is yes, he can do that. The whole point of Kapoil Bottle is to set a standard. What's the standard? What does it mean that you get a wage in order not to have ribis? So the Gemara goes through all of this, that there is a standard. Now, if you sit down with the investor and negotiate a different amount, that won't make it ribis. It'll
But
mean
the community will look and say, this guy's giving his work for nothing. So, he's not getting paid for doing this, and he's got to wait. So, this is the
the worst that'll
artificial.
happen, Michael, is that the community will say this guy is taking far less than anybody else would take for this partnership. But on the flip side, Like you say, there's a high demand for the product, and he believes that he's going to make a lot more in the sale of the building, so he's willing to do it. So the community at large might scratch their heads and say, why would this guy take so little money as a wage? But nevertheless, the wage takes off the edge. The wage takes off the chashash of ribis because he's getting some money. He's getting something paid.
But it's against the standard of what the community would say is the standard, and
Right.
there is total risk involved
Right.
at the end of the day. So, I
But
mean,
that standard is the opening salvo, not necessarily the closing salvo. The opening salvo is kapoil bottle. Now, that a kapoil bottle is considered fair. It's fair. But if this guy says, you know what, I'm willing to hedge my bets, then who am I on the outside looking in to say he can't? He's a good worker. He works efficiently. He'll take less money and more on the other side. That's completely fine. That's
but we're
completely
always worried about appearance. I mean, see, this is form over substance in my
right.
opinion.
Exactly. We're worried about appearance, but once he gets a wage, then the community can no longer say he's working for free, and that's ribis to the investor.
Even if
So,
it's only a nickel an hour, he still got paid.
right, exactly right.
Okay.
Right. A
All right.
wage is a wage, no matter how you look at it. All right. So now, okay. So now we understand why the Gemara, the Mishnah has to give us both examples of both produce and money, because learning one doesn't necessarily preclude us from saying that the other is the same, as we just said. So you need the case of produce where he's getting an easier job, and you need the case of money where he's doing a harder job. And in either case, that would be, if the parties agree, that would be an acceptable way of doing it. Otherwise, as the Mishnah, as the Gemara now explains, that one is okay, one is not. If you only have one of the two, you can't learn out both sides of the coin, produce and money. Okay, so the Gemara says tzricha. That's why we need it. Now, the Gemara goes on, the Mishnah goes on and tells us further. What does the Mishnah tell us? That a Moshivan Tana goes lemechza. That okay. So now we switch and say that if someone happens to have if someone who has the investor says, you go ahead and take your hens and lay eggs, and we'll sell the eggs, then that's not acceptable. And also, when shamin agolin asyachen lemechza. And the same thing is that you put a, let's say you have a sheep, and you need someone to tend them. So you go to a shepherd and you say, go ahead and take care of my sheep or my calves or whatever the case may be, and we'll split the profit. So once again, what's happening here is the chashash ribis. Why? Because it looks like one guy is working for free, and he's willing to give the investor something over and above the agreed. Now, again, from an appearance standpoint, he's working for free. If he's working for free, by definition, that would be ribis, because you can't give someone the benefit of something in the case of a loan, only in the case of a loan that appears to be a benefit. So in other words, we're very makpid that it shouldn't look that way. In this particular case, if he's just giving him the work and he's not doing anything, then that's ribis. So the Mishnah says, schar amalo mazono. So what does he have to do? Just like we said before, he has to give him some kind of a wage, right? And he also has to give him whatever the cost is to feed the hens or to feed the calves, because that too would be a giveaway. If the shepherd or the farmer had to pay the money for the feed, then he's giving the investor the benefit of something that he shouldn't be entitled to. So that's the case of the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Kama is v'gina malin simon. So how much are the, let's say, the hens worth that that he has to pay him something? Okay, that's the general question. So now the Gemara wants to tell us that there are several brises that will help us understand this Mishnah, what it means that he has to that he has to give him in order to take it out from the question of ribbis. Okay. All right. So the first order is what do we pay? Is it before we said it was kapoil bottle, right? That was a standard. At least it's a starting standard. So what do we say here? Do we say poil bottle? I mean, what is it that he has to pay him that it shouldn't be ribbis? And again, in a community where there is a standard, then l'chayra you should follow that standard. You really should follow that standard. And the money guy, the investor, can say, I'm paying you a fair wage because look around. Everybody's paying that kind of a wage. So the guy can always say, no, I can't accept that. But at least going in, he's giving him a fair wage that it should not be treated as ribbis. Because to your point, Michael, earlier, if a person is willing to accept far less wage for a greater share of the profits, then the community at large might still look at this and say he's giving him something that is unfair. He's giving him something more than his share of the deal. That's what we're worried about. We're worried about the fact that a 70-30 split of the profits for a much smaller wage might be looked at as giving him a benefit that he's not entitled to, meaning the investor is now getting a benefit that he's not entitled to because look what he's paying. He's paying so little money. So that's the chashash. That's what we are worried about as to how that will reflect. But Lemaisa, at the end of the day, the parties can negotiate. It isn't one size fits all. It's the opening agreement. Now, the closing agreement, the parties can make their own agreement, but the Gemara is only telling us this is the standard that someone should look at and say this is what this community is paying for that type of work because it's easier than what the guy was making before. All right, fine. But now, do we say the same thing here? Frank says, Tanarabanan. So is it the same standard? Kama hu scharo. What is the wage? What's the schar that he would give a shepherd or a farmer to lay the eggs? Right? So to your point, Michael, Bain Maruba, Bain Muit. Whatever they agree. They can agree. Different Reb Meir. Reb Meir says there is no standard. If you want to pay him more, you pay him more. If you want to pay him less, you pay him less. The outside world can't taina, oh, he's making a killing and therefore it's ribbis because he's making something more than he's entitled to. No, we don't say that. This Brisa says, there's different manda omrim, but Reb Meir says it's up to the parties. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda goes one step further and he says, forget about what they negotiate. If he gives them just a dried fig, that's enough. That's the equivalent of a penny, right? He's giving them almost nothing. But the parties can do that because it takes the edge off ribbis by having given him a wage. And there's no minimum of what a wage is. Yeah, he invites him in, gives him a fig and says, now let's get to work. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, he goes one step further than Reb Meir. Reb Meir just says a lot or a little, and Rabbi Yehuda is saying, yeah, a real little, just a fig. So, so zescharo, that's considered schar. It's considered schar. Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Shimon ben Yochai says that no, that we're not going to allow that because that will give the appearance of ribis because he is working for almost nothing. And therefore, the outside world will say the investor is getting a major benefit from the work that he shouldn't be entitled to. Again, this is sort of an objective standard. So Reb Shimon Yochai says we got to protect. So Reb Shimon Yochai, by saying that, is really saying kapayil batal. What he's saying is that since there's a standard, and we know what that standard is, kapayil batal. Therefore, when he's going to negotiate with him, you can't just say, "Oh, I'll give you a fig or I'll give you $10 or whatever it is." You got to pay him what the standard is, so people in the community will not say, "Oh, he's getting a benefit that he's not entitled to," and that's ribis. So to all the discussion we had to date, we see this runs the gamut. Reb Shimon Yochai says you can't give him less than Poil Bottle. You can't give him less than the standard because that's a chashash. Rabbi Yehuda says you give him a dried fig and it's enough. And Reb Meir says no standard at all. It could be a dried fig. It could be whatever they agree upon. It's got to be something, but it has to be. It has to be so. In a way, Rabbi Yehuda is the biggest makel because you don't really get much lower than a dried fig. I mean, right? And Rabbi Meir says you got to give him a lot or a little. L'chayra, that's more than a dried fig. And Rabbi Shimon Yochai says forget about that. You got to give him what the standard is in the community, so that people should not say it has the appearance of ribbis. That's what we're concerned about. What will the outside world say? So to your point earlier, Michael, about a private negotiation, both Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would agree with you. Sure, you can agree to a private negotiation because that's perfectly acceptable. Rav Shimon Yochai says, no, I can't agree to a private negotiation because that will give rise to people saying it's ribbis. Notice again that we said this at the very beginning, how people are so careful not to have ribbis in a deal is how far will we go to say there isn't ribbis? How far will we go? This is a good example of the machlokes of how far we'll go. Either just a nominal nothing or the standard in the community. Anything less than the standard of the community might be considered ribbis. That's what Rav Shimon Yochai is saying. So, all right. So we see that there is a machlokes here of what it means to pay this shepherd or this farmer, and there's three mandomrim. Now, says the Gemara further, Tan Rabbanan, Ein shaman lo es ha'izim v'lo es ha'rachaylim, that you can't establish a value and shaman lo. You can't establish a value for the goats or the sheep or whatever. V'lo kol davar she'eina osa v'ochel. So this is a new discussion, and the Gemara is telling us that when it comes to a negotiated agreement between the worker and the investor, that you cannot put values on what the items are, because why? Because these are chefsam. These are items, meaning a goat. Called ochel, because all it does is eat and it doesn't work. In other words, if there doesn't seem to be any initial expense that the investor has to undertake, he just says, okay, we're going to agree that the EZIM are worth $100, and that's the base cost. And when we sell it, if we sell it for 200, we'll split the profits. But in the meantime, you got to feed them, right? and these animals don't work. Remember, animals who work is considered a schar. That's like getting paid. So in other words, if the shepherd could make some money off tending the sheep because he's taking these sheep and let's say he hires them out to somebody who could use the sheep or the goats for whatever purpose, that's the wage. That's the equivalent of the wage. But something that doesn't work and only eats, there's no benefit to the shepherd. What's he getting? Once
Right,
again, that looks like
what
ribbis.
he's getting. So let's take the sheep as an example.
Yeah,
The investor donates the sheep.
yeah.
The worker is a person who will pull the wool and make
Oh, oh, oh.
Shetland
Okay.
sweaters.
You're getting a little bit ahead of us, but you're right. Okay, we're going to go in that direction here in a minute about what the benefits are. So
So
you're
he's
right.
working to do that. I mean, I'll wait till the Gemara, but he's working to do that. He wouldn't have been able to do his craft if the sheep were not donated, and he's not getting paid a wage, but they have to sell the sweaters to get there. So
Right.
I don't
Right.
understand. Again,
No,
it has the
you're
appearance of
notice.
ribis because he didn't have to supply anything but his labor, but and so he should be paid for his labor under this doctrine. But
Correct.
in 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 reality, he's making a product that is going to be sold, and he is getting the benefit of splitting the profits for what's sold. But if he didn't have the sheep, he couldn't do his craft. So is that ribis?
Right. So according to the Tanakhama, in other words, this first position, which is could be Rameir, we don't exactly know, but according to the Tanakhama, that you can't do it because again, there is the fear of ribis, is that all he's doing is working and getting nothing else. That's the Tanakhama. In other words, you'll see from the Machlokes what we discussed, what you just raised. So, according to the Tanakhama, as long as there is no benefit, immediate benefit to the worker, other than the fact that he's working for a profit, right? Because they made an agreement that the Ezim are worth a certain amount of money. They know they'll be able to sell it for more money. So he's going to go ahead and make his share of the profit, but at the same time, he's giving free labor. What we're most concerned about is free labor, Michael, because once you give free labor, that's an add-on, that's a benefit to the lender, because we're considering the investor to be a lender.
But
Once he gets a free benefit, then this whole Gemara that we're talking about is the chashash ribis because the worker is not getting anything for his work. He's just giving it free.
But the ridiculousness of this, Rabbi, is that if he bought the sheep himself, he wouldn't get paid, and then he could shear the sheep and sell the product. If somebody else owned the sheep and paid him a wage as an employee, he could do that. But if he
Correct.
wanted to go into business with somebody else who was providing the sheep and he wasn't getting paid a wage, but he was going to get the benefit of a reward on the product, it's ribis. But the other two situations are not. It just doesn't make sense. It's just a different way of doing business.
Right. But you're thinking of it in the normal course of business, and other than ribis, take ribis out of the equation. There's nothing wrong with that kind of partnership. One guy supplies all of the goods, and one guy just has to work.
But there's
The
no
guys,
ribis here because the guy who's doing the work can't afford the sheep to shear. So he gets the profits though, and he would make more because he's such a good craftsman than he would as an employee. Yet the appearance, this is so much form over substance. And as you said before, if the parties negotiate, then it's between them. They know what's happening. We don't worry about what people think. So I don't understand how he will make out better, but he can't do it because it looks bad. I mean, this is the case of Morris Iron. Not every case of Morris Iron is truly Morris, something bad. It just looks bad.
Okay, but you see from the previous discussion, that other brisa, that everybody agreed, Rav Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, they all agreed that something has to be paid. There has to be a minimum, whether it's a throwaway or whether it's
Well,
really.
not Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. He
He says it
said
has to be
it's got
kapar
to be a
batel,
full amount. So if
a
that's the
full amount of kapar
halacha, then
batel.
the other two opinions don't matter.
Right, but at a minimum, a wage has to be paid to take the edge off ribbis. So in the case of the shepherd, if he gets an item, let's say he has the sheep and he tends the sheep and he pays them, but like you said, he can shear the wool and maybe make some money out of shearing the wool. That's a schar. That's a
So let me
wage.
ask you, Rabbi, if he got the shears as a gift personally, instead of putting it into the business, and he was paid by getting the special scissors to shear the sheep,
Who paid him?
the investor,
Yeah.
instead of throwing that money into the investment of
He gave him the shears.
partnership, he
Right.
gives him personally the shears and says, "This is your wage. I'm giving you this
Yeah,
into
yeah.
perpetuity." That would
That's
be fine, right?
that would be fine. That would be fine, sure. As long as something is exchanged that it takes the edge off a completely free, a completely free a giveaway. The giveaway for free is what we're concerned to be the chashash ribbis. Once there is something that is exchanged, sure, he can buy him the scissor, or he can say, come in for a cup of coffee. I mean, as long as there is something that exchanges outside of the profit and loss of the deal, that's considered a schar.
But not according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai.
No,
Not
Shimon Yochai says
equivalent to that
you have to have a much
value.
higher standard, right? Shimon Yochai says you have to much higher
And
standard.
is that the halacha, Rabbi?
The halacha is that the partners can negotiate. Okay, like I said, the parallel bottle is a lachatchila. We go in saying that this is what it should be. It's not insulting for you to say, I'll pay you what the going wage is for someone who gives up a hard job for an easier job. And the guy could say, fine. Now, if the parties, if the worker says, you know what, I'm a good worker and I know that I'm going to make more money by entering into this deal, he may well agree to a smaller wage and get a bigger share of the profits. So, but once again, there has to be something that exchanges hands. So the Tanakhama says that that like we just said, the low koldovasha and osev ochel. So he can't give him something that he only does the malacha, but in other words, when the shepherd gets it and he has to feed it, then from the people looking at it, they're going to say that's a benefit to the investor that is improper. But if it works, if he can work it, and we'll see what work it means in a minute, then that is like the shears, the investment giving the shears. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yossi, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, says, Shaman Izim, that you can do that. I'm allowing you to enter in such a deal. Why? If they shecholvos, because they give the goats provide you can get milk from the goats. Therein lies the wage. In other words, the shepherd, while he's tending the goats, is milking them, and once he milks them, that's schar. That's already a wage. So in other words, it's a different slant on what we've been saying is that if he can get the sheep to do some work for him, which he will keep, not share with the investor, then that's considered a schar. That's considered a wage. V'eser and the sheep, morotos. Then because again, he can get the wool. In the interim, he will get get the wool before, because the deal isn't that he will supply him with the wool. The deal is he wants the investor has sheep and he wants them to be fed and everything else. So the sidebar is that he'll get something out of the wool. He'll sell it, make a few dollars. So in other words, once again, we see the different approaches. He doesn't have to give him the wage directly. It means that the worker has to be able to derive some benefit from the item that he is working on, so that it doesn't look like ribis, because he's getting some benefit outside of the agreement for profit. So that's really the ikr. If they make an agreement for profit and he does nothing, that's ribis. If they make an agreement for profit and he gets something out of it, either a milk or wool or whatever it happens to be, the esatarnagolas and the hen mipnishu osev ocheles, because along the way the hen will lay eggs and he'll take the eggs and eat them, right? He'll eat the eggs. So that too is schar. That too is schar. So in other words, we see that this is a different approach to what parties can enter into without being considered ribis. Okay, so that's an interesting thing. Frek the Gemara V'Tanakama. What about the Tanakama? What did the Tanakama we just said is that you can't enter into such a deal at all, right? So in other words, if there's no work, but all it does is eat, then once again that looks like ribis. So what about the Tanakama? Giza v'cholek lo sipik schar amolo mizono. Typically, the goats will provide milk, or typically the sheep will give out some wool. So in other words, it isn't just a black hole, a void. Inevitably, there will be, when we say work, when Tanakama says work, he means that he'll get some kind of wage for using the animal for work. But he doesn't discuss what happens when you milk a goat. That's not work. I mean, we're not considering that to be work. We're considering that to be something that is a necessity to be able to. Well, it's for the goat's benefit too, of course, and sometimes the goat has to be milked. So, l'chaira, so the Gemara is asking, isn't that considered a wage? How can the Tanakhama say that it's not a wage because it's not working and only eating? Memela, there will be some kind of benefit in the case of the goat, whether you're milking it or not. So why is the Tanakhama so harsh in saying that you can't enter into such a deal, right? So the Gemara says, "Begiza v'cholev kula alma lo pligi." No, when it comes to the milking of the goat or the shearing of or the wool for the sheep, even the Tanakhama says that's okay. In other words, you misread what the Tanakhama was saying. Tanakhama was saying that something that doesn't work and only eats is considered ribis. But if you can get the milk, and if you can get or the wool, then no machlekes. Where is the machlekes? Where, for instance, he doesn't. The milking is for the benefit of the investor. He just gets I mean, let's say a portion of the milk that is considered a throwaway, right? So if he doesn't get the actual milk, but he gets something else, that's considered ribis. And the same thing, and I thought you were going to say this before, Michael, is that he's not really getting the wool. What he's doing is part of his job is that he has to clean up the animal, whatever it is. And in the course of that, some of the wool comes off. In other words, it isn't shearing the wool so that he gets the benefit. It's totally ancillary to what he's doing. So when there's such a minimum amount of benefit, says the Tanakama, that's ribbis. So now we're distinguishing between whether or not he's truly getting something, i.e., milk or wool, or whether, in the case of milk, there may be some byproduct that he's getting, which is a throwaway, literally a
So,
throwaway.
so Rabbi, if in the case of sheep or in the case of hens, let's say hens, they're selling eggs, the investor invests in the hens, he's maintaining them and keeping them. They're selling the eggs. If he can take all the eggs that he needs for himself, that would be considered the wage.
Right,
Similarly, if he could take all the wool he needed to make clothes and
right,
garments for his family, that would be okay because
right,
there's the wage in it, and then he can sell everything else.
right.
So the Tanakama even agrees in that situation that he is getting paid even though they're
Correct.
selling stuff.
Correct. It's only when the byproduct is so minimal that no one would say he's really getting something out of it. So again, it's nuanced. It's very carefully nuanced as to what it is. Now, so let's go a little weiter. So what's the machlekes? What is the machlekes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi ben Yehuda? So Tanakama sabalei corruption ben Yechoy. Now we're going to bring it back to what we said before. The Tanakama says that I hold like Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the amanois l'schor mishon, that he has to pay him what is the standard wage in the community, right? And if you're giving him just some byproduct from the item, the world will look at that and say, no, that's ribbis, because he's not getting something fair, as Shimon ben Yochai says, kapel bottle, right? So he has the highest standard. So the Tanakama holds like Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda, savalei kavua. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Yehuda, holds like his father. What does his father say? Damafilu lo tavel imo ela b'tzir. V'lo ochel imo ela grogris achas. Rabbi Yehuda was the one who said, give him a pittance. Just give him a dried fig. So Rabbi Yossi will say that getting the byproduct of the milk, which is minimal, or getting just some of the wool that he rubs off the animal when he cleans the animal, that's the equivalent of a dried fig. That's the same as a dried fig, and a dried fig is a minimum amount of wage. So it really, the whole question now in this machlekes turns on what will people look at and say that the investor is getting an unfair benefit and therefore it should be considered ribbis. So this whole discussion that we had is what's the standard? If you say the standard is kapile bottle, then you can't go less than a pile bottle. And that's what Shimon Yochai says. Otherwise, the world will say he's giving him a benefit that he's not entitled to. The other Mandamrim, Rab Meir, says whatever the parties agree. Rabbi Yehuda says literally a pittance, a dried fig. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I hold like my father. My father says that you can just give him a nominal amount. So the byproduct of the milk or the little tufts of wool that come off in the washing, that's considered schar. Now, of course, this, there's a question of Maris Ayin, all the things we talk about. And of course we have to be mindful of that. But the question is, from a halacha standpoint, what can the parties do? At the end of the day, the two parties are in a room and they're making a deal. And they know that they're Erlich Yidden, and they know that ribbis is forbidden. So now they want to construct a deal that avoids ribbis. So now the question is, okay, you have three choices. You can say, go by the standard, Reb Shimon Yochai, negotiate whatever you want, more or less, which we talked about earlier, or I'll give you just some nominal amount to take the edge off and say this is a wage. The world itself will say it's not a wage, but you and I can agree it's a wage. We can agree that whatever our agreement is, that from the standpoint of the worker, it's a fair deal because he's making money without having money. In other words, There are a lot of people who don't have money. How are they going to get parnasa? So this is part of the way the Gemara says people should get parnasa is they should enter into a partnership, right? Iska, enter into a partnership with someone who has the money but not the wherewithal, and you have the wherewithal to make that money and turn that money into a profit. That's a good shidduch. That's what an Iska is. So when we talk about ribis now, fast forward to today, where we have this heter Iska, and it's how you couch it that makes all the difference in the world as to whether or not you can enter into an agreement where what seems to be interest, ribis, is not ribis because of the arrangements people make. So that's really what this whole discussion is about: is how do we go about doing that? So we're going to stop here because the Gemara goes even further and tells us a little bit more about these cases. But from what we have today, we've learned about Poil Bottle, and then we see that Poil Bottle is only one standard from one Mandi Yomer, and there's other standards, and depending on how you look at it, there's a very minimal standard in there, and then the Poil Bottle is what would be considered a fair standard that doesn't take advantage of the worker. That's what I think the Gemara wants to tell us, because otherwise it's catch as catch can. What should I pay him? I mean, what should I pay him that he considered a wage and not otherwise? So the Gemara sets a standard to Poil Bottle, but we see that can be negotiated. A Poil Bottle makes. I mean, Shimon Yechoy would not be unhappy if the Poel got more than 50%. I mean, his shita is he shouldn't get less. You don't give him less than what the standard is. But in other words, he's not hard and fast and saying that's the only way to make a deal, but don't minimize him for less, because that will look to the world like ribis. But in fact, so Reb Meir's standard is maybe the fairest standard, is that the parties can negotiate every which way they want, because at the end of the day, as long as he's getting some schar, we don't know the pratim, the specifics of a deal as to what he's getting. He doesn't have to air that out to the public, because his deal is his deal. But as long as they see, oh, he's getting something for his work, then that takes it out of ribis. Okay, so that's where we are, and Mitzvah will continue on because there's more to this discussion. But we see that look at the minimum standard according to Rabbi Yehuda, is that you almost have to give him nothing, and still it's not considered ribis. So that becomes the standard. I think that from a halacha standpoint, there has to be something, and then the question becomes what that something is that will take it out of the realm of ribis.